Hello and welcome back to the 8th episode of this year of Japan Memo, the IISS Japan Chair Programme podcast. I'm Robert Ward, Japan Chair and Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy here at the IISS. In this series, we bring together experts, strategists and practitioners to analyse why Japan matters in today's regional and global geopolitical landscape. Today we're going to be discussing the recent geopolitical and security crises in the Middle East and their impact on Japan, its security and its economy. I can think of few better qualified experts to discuss this with me than our two guests today, Professor Ikeuchi Satoshi and Sakanashi Sachi-san. And before we start the discussion, let me briefly introduce our two brilliant guests. Ikeuchi Satoshi is Professor of the Division of Religion and Global Security at the Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology, RCAST, of the University of Tokyo. Satoshi is the founding chairperson of the RCAST Open Laboratory for Emergent Strategies, known as ROLES. His research on Islamic political thought and Middle East politics is widely recognized in Japan and has garnered several book awards. His book, Islamukoku no Shogeki, in English, The Impact of the Islamic State, published in 2015, was a bestseller in Japan and awarded the 69th Mainichi Publishing Cultural Prize. He was a visiting professor at Alexandria University in 2007 to 2008, a visiting scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Centre for Scholars in 2009, and visiting fellow at Clare Hall at the University of Cambridge in 2010. Welcome, Satoshi.
Thank you very much for having me on this program.
A warm welcome to you, Satoshi. And our second guest is Sakanashi Sachi, and she is the director of the JIME Center, that is the Middle Eastern Studies Center at the Institute of Energy Economics, Japan, the IEEJ. The fields of her research interest are contemporary Iranian politics, the energy industry of Iran, and Japan-Iran relations. She worked for 2 years, from 2000 to 2002, as a cultural attaché at the Japanese embassy in Tehran. She was a visiting fellow at the Gulf Research Center, which was then based in Dubai, in 2008. She is a frequent contributor to Japanese journals, including Gaiko, which is published by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan, and Kikan Arab, which I think translated as Quarterly Arab, which is published by the Japan Arab Association. She has also contributed a piece to a recently published book titled America's War and Global Crisis, The Consequences of the Invasion of Iran. She obtained her master's degree in international relations from the University of Tokyo. Welcome, Sachi.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Let's start our discussion, and let's start by looking at Japan-Iran relations. Although Japan has a critical security alliance with the United States, Japan has also maintained, I think it's fair to say, a unique diplomatic and economic relationship with Iran, despite the tensions between the US and Iran. A question to you both. Could you give us some background on why the Japan-Iran relationship has evolved as it has? And of course, how do you view the direction of Japan-Iran relations, and what do you think will be the impact this will have on Japan's energy security? So a lot of questions in there. Satoshi, you first, please.
First of all, the Islamic Revolution did not provoke such strong opposition among the Japanese public as in the West. So that's why in the past half a century, Japan's relations with Iran was very amicable, even under the strong sanction by the United Nations or particularly United States. For the Japanese public, Japan did not have very acrimonious relations with Iran, such as the embassy hostage crisis with the US. Basically, the general public doesn't have a very strong feeling or strong negative feeling about Iran. When the end of the war would be clearly announced and lifting sanctions by the US, I think Japan's business community will go back to Iran. And in the past decade, it's always about sanction by the US, which was disturbed or almost freeze or stopped, blocked Japan's relations with Iran. The recent memorandum signed by both President of the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran, the memorandum and lifting of sanction in the coming weeks or months will change Japan's relation with Iran in a very positive way. So making the long story short, after the sanction, Japan will come back to Iran.
So interesting, you say that the Islamic Revolution didn't produce a strong reaction in Japan. Why was that? Because I remember back in 1979, and it was one of the first big political events that I can remember actually when I was actually much younger. And in Europe, the impact was pretty large, but in Japan, less so. Why is that?
First of all, Iran is far away from Japan, and the economic interest in Iran, particularly by the Iranians abroad, doesn't exist. In the case of US or in Europe, I think there are Iranian exiles who are trying to destabilize relations with the countries in Europe and Iran, or of course, US and Iran. But in Japan, there's no such a strong political interest among the people living in Japan. So basically, the Iran issue, particularly revolution and the dismantling of the Ancien regime, was not the strong political or domestic issue in Japan. So I think that's a most important reason there was not a strong feeling among Japanese public, and it didn't become a political issue after the revolution.
Thank you. And Sachi, you've lived in Tehran, and I think you speak Farsi as well. What's your take on the background of Japan-Iran relations and the direction that they get likely to go in?
Yes, thank you for that excellent question. Your question really captures the structural dilemma that shapes Japan's foreign policy. In my understanding, this unique relationship evolved because Japan has historically had to balance two different types of survival. On one hand, Japan relies entirely on the United States for its national security. That is our strategic anchor. On the other hand, Japan is almost completely dependent on foreign imports for its fossil fuels. Because we have virtually no fossil fuels on our own, every resource-rich nation, including Iran, is a potentially critical partner for Japan. In addition, for decades, maintaining a friendly relationship with Tehran was viewed by Tokyo not as a liability, but as a valuable diplomatic asset, a unique back channel for dialogue that Japan could offer to the world. However, regarding the direction and impact today, we have hit a turning point. Ever since US-Iran tensions reached the breaking point, back when President Trump announced a maximum pressure campaign against Iran, Japan has had no choice but to prioritize its alliance with the United States. As a result, Japan has completely suspended its imports of Iranian crude oil since 2019, and our bilateral trade has shrunk dramatically. But let me stress this one thing. While current political realities have almost frozen our trade, the underlying structural reality has not changed. Iran remains potentially a vital country for Japan's energy security because of its geography and massive reserves. Looking ahead, Japan will always view Iran through a pragmatic lens. That is, while we must stand firmly with the United States today, a stable and open relationship with Iran remains a crucial piece of Japan's broader energy puzzle in the long run.
So you're relatively optimistic about Japan-Iran relations going forward because of this structural issue that you cited.
I wouldn't call it optimistic because we are not sure if the sanctions will be really lifted. It should be a great news. And as Professor Ikeuchi said, if the sanctions are lifted, Japanese companies will start doing business with Iran again. But at this moment, we are not sure yet if that will actually happen. I think there will be a very difficult negotiation between the US and Iran, and we will have to wait for the result of that.
This brings us to looking ahead a bit more and energy security and supply chain security after the war. And the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz had a significant impact on Japan's energy security, as it has on pretty much all the other energy consumers in the world. Sachi, if I can continue with you for a moment, how do you assess these negotiations with Iran over the opening of the Strait of Hormuz? And you've both talked about the MOU and so on. And what's your feeling given your knowledge of Iran, about how durable any agreement will be?
While the latest US-Iran memorandum includes an agreement to keep the Strait of Hormuz open, the actual future of the talks is highly unpredictable. Moreover, the deal requires a ceasefire on all fronts before serious negotiations can even begin. This allows Iran to play a strategic game. If the ceasefire fails and the strait stays closed, Tehran can easily shift the blame to its rivals for failing to maintain the truce. But from Japan's standpoint, what matters most is not who is at fault. An open strait is a matter of immediate survival for our energy security, and ultimately, if these political maneuvers lead to long-term instability in the strait, it will only have one concrete outcome. It will fundamentally accelerate Japan's shift away from its heavy dependence on the Middle Eastern oil, a shift that is likely already happening.
Just to tag one more question onto that before I move to Satoshi, you're with the IEEJ as well. How do you feel that Japan's energy resilience planning has held up against this crisis? Because Japan's had a long history of economic security planning, the oil shocks of the 70s and the strategic building up of strategic reserves and so on. Do you think this planning has been effective given the depth of the shock we're experiencing?
Yes, this is the second biggest oil shock that Japan has experienced in its recent history. The first one was in 1973 when the Fourth Arab-Israeli War happened. And since then, Japanese government has tried to introduce policies for energy security in our country. And one of the most important policies was strategic petroleum reserves. When the war broke out in the end of February, we had about 250 days of strategic petroleum reserves. So people were saying that if the war ends within 8 months, Japan will be okay. But actually, things were not that easy. Regarding crude oil, we had SPR, but regarding oil products such as naphtha, we didn't have any reserves like we had with crude oil. So there were many disruptions in supply chains, and many companies that needed naphtha couldn't get it as they used to do. There was a lot of problems. And I think the biggest problem was that people would always talk about the possibility of the closure of Strait of Hormuz, but then people were not really thinking that it will actually happen. People were saying that Strait of Hormuz is actually crucial for the Iranian economy as well. So Iran wouldn't do that because it's really suicidal. And also because so many countries in the world depend on the Strait of Hormuz, people were saying that Iran wouldn't do things like closing the Strait of Hormuz because it would then antagonize the whole world. So people were counting on the possibility that Iran wouldn't do that. But actually at this time, because US and Israel, two biggest military powers in the world, attacked Iran jointly, and then the Iranian Islamic Republic of Iran felt that it was the moment of survival or death. And then they started to act in a way that we had not expected. We were not really ready for the real closure of the strait. And once the Strait of Hormuz was closed, there were many problems, not regarding crude oils, regarding oils, like regarding gasoline. Japanese government even provided subsidies in order to keep the prices low. But regarding the oil products, such as naphtha, that is material for plastics that we use in everyday life, we faced a serious shortage, and the problem is not completely solved yet in today's Japan.
Just continuing with this, a question for you, Satoshi. Sachi was talking about the range of items, commodities, and so on that's been affected by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Plus, of course, there's the broader impact on the growth model of the GCC, I suppose, open trade, tourism, and so on. Looking from Japan's perspective, and you know the GCC and the broader region really well, where do you think this leaves the region from Japan's perspective after this conflict eventually ends?
The Gulf Arab states, GCC countries, which are composed of 6 Gulf states, were placed in a precarious position by the outbreak of the war and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The GCC countries have been the hardest hit by the war, and to put it bluntly, could end up as the losers. That's the situation. And in my word, Iran got effectively a key on the Strait of Hormuz. And with that key, Iranian regime can open and close the Strait of Hormuz. So in a way, GCC countries are locked in the Persian Gulf of this premises. And US is watching. In a way, US has a duplicate key of the Strait of Hormuz with Iran. So in a way, 2 countries, the one superpower and one regional power, have a common duplicate key on the Strait of Hormuz, and GCC and Gulf Arab states are, in a way, locked into the Persian Gulf. So Japan had been heavily reliant on the oil and gas, particularly crude oil from the GCC countries in 6 Arab states in the Gulf, particularly since 2019, under the intense pressure from the United States. Japan has not purchased a single drop of oil from Iran. So Japan was more than 90% reliant on the crude oil transported from the Persian Gulf by the sourcing from the GCC countries. GCC countries were hit, and also Japan as an importer, hit hard. In the past 3 months, Japan has been frantically trying to bypass the Strait of Hormuz or reroute the transportation of oil and gas. Not only that, Japan has been trying very hard to find a alternative source of oil and gas away from the Middle East. So there's been huge shift on the side of Japan. I'm not sure GCC countries has already felt this shift has made, but even in the short term or middle term, GCC countries and Japan come to terms with their positions. Japan is feeling the higher risk of oil and gas from the Middle East after such a period of disruption or almost hiatus of the normal business relations in the Iran war. GCC countries need some discount or some assurance on the oil and gas transported to Japan. So I think that in the next phase, Japan and GCC countries has to coordinate with each other based on this changed expectations on the region and the energy resources, materials from this region.
Just a connected question to that, what you've just said, Satoshi. Do you see any change in Japan's relations, for example, with Saudi Arabia? The relations are very good between those two. And presumably, there'll be more oil facilities built on the Red Sea side of Saudi. Do you see that there any sort of change in relations, or will the two, from what you just said, there'll be more tighter coordination perhaps between Saudi and some of the other GCC countries, or are relations so good and important that they'll remain steady state after this?
Basically, Japan's relations was and has been and is very good to each one of these countries in the region, even including Iran, even though under the pressure, as I said, Japan ceased to purchase oil and gas for the past 5 or 6 years. But basically, bilateral relations are very good. But what I'm trying to say is it's the Gulf as a region is, in a way, partially replaced by other regions with natural energy resources. And so even though bilateral relations are very good, there has been some shift or rebalancing of the portfolio of the source of energy. That's one thing. The Gulf region as a whole, in a way, lessened its importance on Japan's energy security. And another thing is, now the Gulf, particularly Gulf Arab states, are divided. They have 6 states, and they have 6 positions in GCC. So that's a very different situation before the war. And before the war, there has been 2 or 3 camps. But now they have 6 camps because it was now obvious. It became clear that 6 countries have different national interests and different conditions. And so the 6 countries are trying to find solutions, or they may not have solutions, but they try to adjust to the situation in 6 different ways. So Japan has to, first of all, keep very good bilateral relations, but in this case, there's going to be 6 bilateral relations. And if there's not coordination among GCC countries, Japan's policy would become just 6, and maybe Iran will be open to the global market, then Iran will join this bunch of Japan's bilateral relations. So that's a situation Japan and GCC countries are faced with.
That's interesting. Sachi, just thinking about, Satoshi was talking about Japan looking for other energy sources and so on. And with your energy expertise, Sachi, how do you forecast? Well, 2 things. One is Japan's sourcing of energy. Where do you think that the focus will be? And you mentioned at the start about this crisis perhaps accelerating Japan's shift towards renewables. Could you say just a few more words about that as well?
With the instability surrounding the Strait of Hormuz dragging on, I forecast that Japan's ultimate strategy to secure its energy will be defined by one key word: diversification. Given the severe instability in the Middle East, the consensus in Tokyo is that we have to lower our current level of dependence on the Middle East as soon as possible. We must urgently diversify both where we get our energy and what kind of energy we use. First, in terms of supply sources, Japan is already working to secure oil and gas from everywhere beyond the Middle East, including North America, Latin America, Africa, Central Asia, and Japan is also carefully managing its remaining stakes in Russia. Second, in terms of energy sources, this conflict is accelerating a renewed, serious shift toward domestic nuclear power and renewable energy, as you mentioned. However, the core principle of diversification means that reducing our Middle Eastern dependence to zero is also not a wise option. Japan still needs the region. Therefore, instead of a complete exit, Japan will likely focus on securing its supply by investing in alternative infrastructure, such as pipelines that bypass the Strait of Hormuz. In short, Japan's focused action is a practical balancing act, shrinking our vulnerability through total diversification while protecting our remaining interests in the Middle East in any way we can.
That's interesting. So, Sachi, you're saying that Japan will be an eager, a willing investor as the pipelines are built to the Red Sea to avoid the Strait of Hormuz where it can.
Whatever infrastructure that will be needed in order to bypass the Strait of Hormuz, because we learned from this war that the Strait of Hormuz could be closed. So in order to achieve our energy security, we have to invest in alternative routes as well. And even though I think the reaction in Japan at the moment is that Middle East is too unstable, we cannot keep depending on this unstable region. But at the same time, as I mentioned, we cannot lower our dependence on the Middle East to zero. And we still need good relations with each energy producing country in the region. And in order to improve, make it even better, the relations with the energy producing countries in the region, we can help them build infrastructure that bypass the Strait of Hormuz. That I think will be important for the energy producing countries in the region as well.
Satoshi, is there anything you wanted to add to what Sachi said?
So we were in a total dependence on the Arab Gulf states in 6 countries before the war. But after the war, we have only some tenuous bypass routes from the Gulf to the outside world and eventually to East Asia. But there are also changes because of the war. ironically, Iran will be back to the international market. There is a possibility of maneuverability for Japan. On the one hand, we can strengthen our relations with GCC countries, each countries, and also GCC as a whole of the vital source of energy. And at the same time, even though the relationship across the Gulf, Persian Gulf, or Arabian Gulf, either way we call it, but across the Gulf, there's been a sense of animosity aroused by the war, but still Japan has interest on both sides of the Gulf. Japan's position in the coming decade will be balancing or keeping neutrality among these multi-directional competition conflicts in the Gulf. There are much to do for Japanese policymakers or Japanese huge energy corporation and also general trade corporations to do to keep this balanced and diversified and non-political economic relations with Gulf countries.
It's just your point about, Satoshi, about balancing is a good way of reminding us, I think, that Japan actually quite uniquely within the region, the GCC, Iran, has, I think, quite a lot of trust from both sides in comparison to, say, the case with some of the other developed economies. And that's quite a unique position. But I wondered if it gives Japan that trust that Japan has in the region, whether it gives Japan any agency to try to influence what happens.
I personally believe Japan can be a mediator between Iran and Arab Gulf states. And even though in the very short term coming phase, Japan may be asked to take sides with one of them, but I believe still Japan can navigate in this kind of request and keep its neutrality in this more diversified Gulf after the Iran war.
Well, on that slightly positive note, I think, let's move to Japan memo questions. And we ask all our lovely guests the same two questions. And as I always say, we always have lovely, interesting answers that help those listeners to broaden their knowledge of Japan and our guests. Two questions. Sachi, if I can start with you. Do you have any book recommendations for listeners who want to understand Japan better? Books or articles or anything you've written, even if you want to? And what do you think people often get wrong about Japan?
Regarding the book that I recommend, since we've been discussing the conflict, I'd highly recommend a freshly published book that perfectly captures how Japan views this ongoing crisis. It's edited by Professor Seiko Mimaki, a leading expert on American politics, and the title translates to The American War and Global Crisis: What Will Be the Consequences of the Invasion of Iran? This book brings together 12 top Japanese experts covering everything from US foreign policy and Middle Eastern dynamics, including the strategies of Israel and Iran, to China, multilateralism, and the use of AI in warfare. It gives you a profound look into the multi-layered debates happening inside Japan right now. I also contributed a short chapter to it, focusing specifically on Iran's perspective and its history. This crisis is greatly affecting Japan's energy security, so for listeners who want to understand how Japanese intellectuals are analyzing this global turning point and how Japan is navigating its own geopolitical dilemmas, this is truly a must-read.
Thank you. And what do people get wrong?
Regarding your second question, what do people often get wrong about Japan? I think people often view Japan through its cultural image or its tight security alliance with the United States. But what is rarely recognized is that Japan has to be incredibly pragmatic about its energy security. Because we rely on imports for almost all our hydrocarbon resources, Japan simply cannot view the world in black and white. It is not widely known outside Japan, but our foreign policy is also driven by a calculated necessity for survival. we have to maintain unique friendships, even with countries that are not so pro-US, to protect complex supply chains that often involve Southeast Asia and diversify our energy sources in ways that don't always grab international headlines. So what people get wrong is missing the quiet realism behind Japan's actions. Behind our mild-mannered image lies a country constantly striving for pragmatic survival.
Thank you, Sachi. Well, two excellent answers. And I liked your point about Japan's quiet realism as well. And that was the Defense Minister Koizumi at Shangri-La Dialogue. He made a comment which struck me at the end of May when the dialogue was about Japan's realism as well, echoing what you've said about that. So many thanks. Satoshi, books and what do people get wrong?
I wish I could recommend my own newly published book, but in the near future, I'd recommend my book. But today, I just want to recommend a book recently published by my good friend, a American, originally Egyptian. The title is West Asia, a New American Grand Strategy in the Middle East. The author is Muhammad Suleiman, who is working as consultant in Washington, D.C., and also a non-resident senior fellow for the Middle East Institute. He's a well-known expert on the Middle East. But he recently published this book, which reimagine and redefine the Middle East in the context of the wider Indo-Pacific, which has been the idea in the Pacific as on this format is much owed to the late Prime Minister Abe. And Mr. Suleiman redefined the Middle East as West Asia. And at the same time, even just briefly, he gave us some direction for Japan to locate itself in the newly defined wider Indo-Pacific as the Middle East on the western end and Japan at the eastern end. So it's a very strategic overview and guidance for Japan to live in this newly defined global politics. And this is my recommendation. And do I have any complaint about the Western views on Japan? I have many complaints, but those views are unfortunately correct sometimes. For example, Japan is too much hierarchical and organizations are too bureaucratic, and there are many problems in Japan. But just one point, under the surface of this cover, there are much creativity among Japanese. I think in this volatile new world order, Japanese creativity will be unleashed. That's my point for now.
Excellent. Thank you for that. That's an optimistic point as well. And because you mentioned that you've got a new book out, can you give us the title so we can go and have a look for it?
Actually, I've been writing that book for the past decade or more than decade because among Japanese, some of them are very keen to see the publishing data, and they know I've been prolonging my preparation for the book for the past decade. It's about Arab Spring. No one right now talks anymore about the Arab Spring. It has been moving target. Each month it's moving. We didn't know what the consequences of the Arab Spring, but in my view, Arab Spring finally has been finding its consequences in the final result. But I need still some time to complete that book. But so I hope in the next appearance will recommend my own books about the Middle East, particularly Arab world in the past decade.
Your public is awaiting the publication of your book, so we're all looking forward to it when it finally emerges. So thank you for explaining that. And thank you both, Satoshi and Sachi, for this wonderful discussion. I've certainly learnt a bit more, particularly about Japan and Iran. That's a fascinating relationship, but also about Japan and the GCC and the broader issues there. So many thanks for your thoughts. To our audience, please do follow Satoshi and Sachi where you can on social media. Details of how to do this and of websites and so on will be in the show notes. And thank you again to our listeners for joining us on another episode of Japan Memo. If you have any comments or feedback, please contact Japan Chair at IISS.org, and that's all one word, Japan Chair. And if you enjoyed this episode, we urge you to subscribe to Japan Memo on the podcast platform of your choice. And for more insightful analysis, I also encourage you to look at past research from the Japan Chair Programme and the IISS more broadly on our website. Thank you, Satoshi and Sachi, again. Thank you, listeners, and see you next time. Goodbye.